The 15th of December 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Morning mist clings to frozen earth as a 17-year-old soldier grips a massive logging chain in calloused hands. James Washington, a boy from rural Alabama who had lied about his age to enlist, watches a German Panzer IV tank crawling up the steep hillside towards his position. He has traded cotton fields for battlefields, never imagining that his childhood, amongst timber and farm machinery, would hold the key to one of the war's most unconventional victories. Inside their 30-ton steel fortress, the German crew advances with confidence. Their thick armor and 75mm cannon should easily overwhelm the lightly defended American supply depot ahead. They cannot know what awaits them. Before we continue, if you enjoy these untold stories from history, do consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. What the German tank crews could never have anticipated was this, that sometimes the greatest weapon against modern mechanized warfare wasn't another tank or an anti-tank gun, but the ingenuity of a farm boy who understood leverage, gravity, and the simple physics of heavy machinery better than any military academy could teach. James Washington had been born in 1927 in the rural town of Hayneville, Alabama, where his family operated a small timber concern alongside their cotton farm. From the age of 8, young James worked beside his father and older brothers, learning the intricate art of moving massive logs down steep hillsides, using nothing but chains, pulleys, and careful calculation of weight distribution. By 15 years, he could calculate the exact angle and tension needed to safely lower a 2,000-pound oak log down a 40-degree slope, without losing control or snapping the chain. These skills, developed through years of dangerous work in the Alabama wilderness, would prove invaluable in ways he could never have imagined. The path that led James to that frozen Belgian hillside had begun 14 months earlier, in October 1943, when he walked into the Montgomery recruitment office and claimed he was 18. At 6'2" and weighing 13 stone of solid muscle from years of farm labor, James looked older than his 16 years. The overwhelmed recruitment officer was more interested in meeting quotas than verifying birth certificates. The United States Army was desperate for personnel as the war in Europe intensified. Able-bodied young men from rural backgrounds were particularly valuable for their mechanical aptitude and physical endurance. James had been assigned to the 751st Tank Battalion, one of several separate tank battalions attached to various infantry divisions as needed throughout the European campaign. Unlike many of his fellow soldiers who served as tank crew members or mechanics, James found himself in a specialized logistics unit responsible for equipment recovery and battlefield salvage operations. His commanding officer, Captain Robert Morrison, a career military man from Boston, initially held reservations about the young soldier's age and background. But he quickly recognized that James possessed an almost intuitive understanding of mechanical leverage and weight distribution that proved invaluable in recovering damaged vehicles and equipment from difficult terrain. The 751st Tank Battalion had landed at Normandy in July 1944, 2 months after D-Day, as part of the massive Allied build-up following the successful establishment of their beachhead. James experienced his first taste of combat during the breakout from the hedgerow country of Normandy, where his unit supported the 3rd Infantry Division's advance towards Saint-Lô. It was during this campaign that James first demonstrated his unusual problem-solving abilities. His recovery team had been tasked with retrieving a disabled Sherman tank that had slid into a deep crater created by German artillery fire. Standard recovery procedures called for using another tank or heavy lorry to pull the disabled vehicle from the crater, but the narrow country roads and surrounding hedgerows made it impossible to position recovery vehicles at the proper angle. Whilst his team leader, Sergeant Michael O'Brien, debated calling for additional equipment, James studied the situation and proposed an alternative solution. Using a combination of logging chains, pulleys, and a nearby stone wall. As an anchor point, he designed a leverage system that allowed them to extract the tank. Using only man-powered winches and careful application of mechanical advantage, the success of this operation earned James a reputation within the battalion as someone who could solve seemingly impossible mechanical problems using unconventional methods. Word of his abilities reached Lieutenant Colonel William Matthews, the battalion commander, who began assigning James to increasingly complex recovery operations. By the time the 751st Tank Battalion reached the German border in September 1944, James had become an unofficial specialist in what the Army termed field expedient engineering solutions. If you're finding this fascinating, do hit subscribe. It helps us uncover more stories like what is this? The German counter-offensive that would later be known as the Battle of the Bulge began on the 16th of December 1944, catching Allied forces completely by surprise with base. The 751st Tank Battalion had been positioned near the town of Malmedy, Belgium, as part of the general Allied advance towards the Rhine River. Their mission was to provide armoured support for infantry units whilst maintaining a reserve position that could respond to any unexpected German activity. The massive scale of the German attack, involving over 200,000 men and more than 600 tanks, created chaos throughout the American lines as units found themselves surrounded, cut off or forced to retreat under intense pressure. On the morning of the 15th of December, just one day before the main German offensive began, James Washington found himself assigned to a small detachment tasked with establishing an equipment recovery post on a strategic hillside overlooking the main road between Malmedy and Stavelot. The position, designated Hill 212 by military planners, offered excellent visibility over the surrounding countryside and was considered a relatively safe rear area location. The detachment consisted of James, Sergeant O'Brien, and two other soldiers. Corporal David Chen, a mechanical engineer from San Francisco, and Private First Class Tommy Rodriguez, a former motor mechanic from El Paso, Texas. The hilltop position had been chosen specifically because it provided easy access to the main supply route whilst offering defensible terrain in the unlikely event of German infiltration. A narrow dirt road wound its way up the eastern slope of the hill, whilst the western side dropped away steeply into a wooded valley. American engineers had positioned several pieces of heavy equipment at the site, including a 5-ton wrecker lorry, various recovery chains and cables, and a small fuel depot intended to support recovery operations in the surrounding area. What made Hill 212 particularly significant was its commanding view of the main German approach route from the east. Unknown to the American defenders, German military planners had identified this same road as a critical axis of advance for their surprise offensive. The 5th Panzer Army, under the command of General Hasso von Manteuffel, had designated the capture of this hill as a priority objective for the second day of their offensive, planning to use it as a staging area for further advances towards the Meuse River. James spent the early morning hours of the 15th conducting routine maintenance on the recovery equipment, unaware that German reconnaissance units were already observing his position from concealed locations in the surrounding forest. The recovery detachment had established their camp in a small clearing near the summit of the hill, with their equipment arranged to provide easy access to the main road below. James had to position their heaviest recovery chains in a neat core near the edge of the clearing, following standard military procedure for quick deployment during emergency operations. The chains themselves were massive implements designed for recovering disabled tanks and heavy lorries from battlefield conditions. Each link was forged from high carbon steel and measured approximately 3 inches in length, with the entire chain weighing over 400 pounds and stretching nearly 200 feet when fully extended. These chains were rated to handle loads of up to 50 tons under ideal conditions, though battlefield usage often subjected them to far greater stresses than their manufacturers had intended. James had inspected each link carefully that morning, looking for signs of stress fractures or deformation that might indicate potential failure points. At approximately 10:30 that morning, Sergeant O'Brien received word via radio that German forces had been observed moving in unusual numbers east of their position. The report came from a forward observation post manned by elements of the 28th Infantry Division, who had detected what appeared to be a significant enemy force moving through the forest under cover of the morning mist. O'Brien immediately ordered his detachment to increase their state of alertness and prepare for possible enemy contact. though he still believed their hilltop position was too far from the front lines to face any immediate threat. James was in the process of checking the mechanical condition of their wrecker lorry when he heard the distinctive sound of tracked vehicles approaching from the east. The deep rumbling of diesel engines and the metallic clatter of steel tracks on frozen ground were unmistakable to anyone with experience around armored vehicles. However, the sound was approaching from the wrong direction. American armored units were positioned to the west and north, whilst the east was supposed to be clear of any friendly forces. James immediately alerted Sergeant O'Brien, who grabbed his binoculars and moved to the eastern edge of the clearing to investigate. What O'Brien observed through his binoculars sent a chill down his spine. A column of German tanks was moving up the main road towards their position, led by a Panzer IV medium tank, followed by what appeared to be at least two more armored vehicles obscured by the morning mist. The lead tank bore the distinctive markings of the German army and was advancing with the confident pace of a force that believed it controlled the surrounding territory. O'Brien realized immediately that his small detachment was completely isolated and faced an enemy force that vastly outgunned their limited defensive capabilities. The German tank column was part of Kampfgruppe Müller, a reinforced tank company commanded by Major Heinrich Müller, a veteran officer who had served in Poland, France, and Russia before being assigned to the Western Front. Major Müller's force consisted of 4 Panzer IV tanks, 2 self-propelled anti-tank guns, and a company of mechanized infantry riding in half-tracks. Their mission was to secure the strategic hill overlooking the main supply route and establish a forward command post for follow-on forces advancing towards the Meuse River. Major Müller had studied aerial reconnaissance photographs of Hill 212 and noted the presence of American equipment and personnel, but intelligence reports had indicated that the position was likely held by non-combat troops with minimal defensive capabilities. The German plan called for a rapid advance up the main road, followed by a quick assault that would overwhelm any resistance and secure the hilltop before American reinforcements could arrive. Müller was confident that his experienced tank crews would easily handle whatever opposition they might encounter from what appeared to be a small American logistics unit. The lead Panzer IV tank, commanded by Oberfeldwebel Fritz Weber, began its ascent up the winding road towards the American position. Weber was a 24-year-old tank commander from Bavaria who had joined the German army in 1939 and had seen action in virtually every major campaign of the war. His crew consisted of 4 other experienced soldiers: gunner Hans Kruger, driver Klaus Hoffmann, radio operator Wilhelm Braun, and loader Friedrich Meyer. Together, they had served as a crew for over 18 months and had developed the smooth coordination that came from extensive combat experience. The Panzer they commanded was a late production model equipped with a long-barreled 75mm cannon, capable of engaging enemy armor at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. The tank weighed approximately 25 tons and was powered by a 300 horsepower Maybach engine that provided adequate mobility across most terrain conditions. Its frontal armor was 80mm thick, sufficient to defeat most Allied anti-tank weapons at normal combat ranges, whilst its side and rear armor measured 30mm in thickness. Weber was confident that his tank could handle any resistance the Americans might offer from their hilltop position. A quick note: if you're enjoying this, subscribing really does make a difference. Now back to the story. As the German tank began climbing the steep road towards Hill 212, James Washington found himself in a situation unlike anything his military training had prepared him for. Sergeant O'Brien quickly assessed their tactical options and realized they were extremely limited. Their detachment possessed only small arms, rifles, carbines, and 1 Browning automatic rifle, which were completely ineffective against armored targets. The wrecker lorry mounted a 50-sauce caliber machine gun, but this weapon would barely scratch the paint on a German tank. Their radio equipment had limited range, and attempts to contact higher headquarters for immediate support had so far been unsuccessful. O'Brien gathered his 3 soldiers and outlined their desperate situation. They could attempt to escape on foot through the wooded terrain to the west, hoping to evade German patrols and reach friendly lines. Alternatively, they could attempt to hide their equipment and wait for the German force to pass. though this strategy carried the risk of being discovered and captured. The third option was to make some kind of stand using whatever resources they had available, though this appeared to be nothing more than a suicidal gesture against overwhelming odds. James studied the approaching German tank through binoculars, calculating its rate of advance and the time they had available before it reached their position. The road wound back and forth across the face of the hill, gaining elevation gradually as it approached the summit. He estimated that the tank would reach their position in approximately 15 minutes, assuming it maintained its current rate of climb. However, as he watched the massive steel machine grinding its way up the slope, James began to notice something that sparked an idea based on his years of experience with heavy equipment and steep terrain. The road approaching Hill 212 had been constructed by German engineers earlier in the war as part of their defensive preparations along the west wall. It followed a series of switchbacks that allowed vehicles to climb the steep slope without exceeding safe gradients for wheeled traffic. However, this engineering solution created several potential vulnerabilities that were invisible to anyone, without extensive experience in moving heavy loads across difficult terrain. James recognized these vulnerabilities immediately, his mind automatically calculating angles, weights, and stress factors the same way he had done countless times, whilst moving massive logs down Alabama hillsides. The critical factor that James observed was the relationship between the tank's weight, the steepness of the slope, and the limited maneuvering room available on the narrow road. The Panzer IV weighed 25 tons, and as it climbed the increasingly steep gradient, more and more of that weight was being supported by the tank's rear sprockets and drive wheels. If something were to suddenly arrest the tank's forward momentum whilst it was climbing at maximum grade, the laws of physics would create enormous stress on whatever was preventing the tank from sliding backward down the hill. James had seen this same principle at work hundreds of times in the timber business. When a heavy log was being lowered down a steep slope using chains and pulleys, the system worked smoothly, as long as the chain remained taut and the load moved at a controlled rate. However, if the log's movement was suddenly stopped whilst it was positioned on a steep grade, the accumulated gravitational force would create enormous tension in the restraining chain. If that tension exceeded the chain's breaking point, the results could be catastrophic. James had witnessed more than one logging operation where a snapped chain had sent a massive log tumbling out of control down a mountainside. The key insight that formed in James's mind was the realization that a German tank climbing a steep road was essentially a 25-ton log being hauled up a hillside. If he could somehow arrest the tank's forward progress at exactly the right moment and position, whilst simultaneously applying a sudden backward force, the laws of physics might work in his favor rather than against him. The challenge was working out how to apply those principles using only the equipment and materials he had available on the hilltop. James quickly surveyed their available resources. The most significant asset was the heavy recovery chain, rated for 50-ton loads and approximately 200 feet in length. They also had several smaller chains and cables, various mechanical tools, and the 5-ton wrecker lorry with its powerful winch system. The terrain offered several potential anchor points, including large trees, rock outcroppings, and the wrecker lorry itself. Most importantly, the configuration of the hilltop and the approaching road created a situation where these elements could potentially be combined in a way that would turn the German tank's own momentum against it. Whilst James was formulating his plan, Sergeant O'Brien was becoming increasingly agitated about their tactical situation. The German tank was now clearly visible as it rounded the second switchback, approximately 800 meters from their position and climbing steadily. O'Brien could see additional German vehicles following behind the lead tank, confirming that they were facing a significant enemy force rather than a single isolated vehicle. He ordered Corporal Chen and Private Rodriguez to prepare for immediate evacuation, instructing them to gather essential equipment and prepare to move out on foot through the wooded terrain to the west. However, James approached his sergeant with an alternative proposal. Speaking quickly but with quiet confidence, he outlined his idea for using the recovery chain and the terrain features to create a mechanical trap that might disable the approaching German tank. O'Brien's initial reaction was skeptical. The plan sounded like something from a cartoon rather than a practical military solution. However, as James explained the physics involved and demonstrated his calculations using rough sketches in the dirt, O'Brien began to realize that the young soldier's unconventional background had given him insights that traditional military training would never provide. The plan that James proposed was both simple and complex. Simple in its basic concept. Use the recovery chain to arrest the tank's forward momentum and then apply sudden rearward force to create catastrophic stress on the vehicle's structure. Complex in its execution, requiring precise timing, careful positioning, and a thorough understanding of mechanical principles that most soldiers would never encounter. The success of the plan depended on several critical factors. The tank had to be climbing at maximum gradient when the trap was triggered. The chain had to be positioned to apply force at exactly the right angle. And the timing had to be perfect to avoid giving the German crew any opportunity to react. O'Brien realized that they had very little time to implement James's plan, even if he decided to authorize the attempt. The German tank was now less than 600 meters from their position and climbing at a steady rate. If they were going to try James's unconventional solution, they needed to begin preparations immediately. After a moment of intense consideration, weighing their limited alternatives against the potential risks of James's proposal, O'Brien made his decision. They would attempt to implement the plan whilst maintaining the option to evacuate immediately if the initial setup proved impossible or if the German force appeared to be larger than they could handle. The first step in implementing James's plan was positioning the heavy recovery chain at exactly the right location on the road. James had calculated that the optimal position would be approximately 200 meters down the hill from their current position, at a point where the road made a sharp left turn whilst climbing at its steepest gradient. This location would place the tank at maximum mechanical disadvantage when the trap was triggered, whilst also providing the best angle for applying rearward force through the chain system. James and Corporal Chen quickly carried the massive chain down the hillside, moving carefully to avoid making noise that might alert the approaching German crew. The chain weighed over 400 pounds, making it a challenging load for two men to handle across rough terrain. But James's experience with heavy equipment allowed him to manage the weight distribution efficiently. They positioned the chain across the road at the predetermined location, with most of its length coiled on the uphill side, ready for rapid deployment. Meanwhile, Sergeant O'Brien and Private Rodriguez worked to prepare the anchor system that would provide the mechanical advantage needed to make James's plan work. Using the wrecker lorry as a primary anchor point, they positioned additional chains and cables to create a pulley system that would multiply the force applied by the lorry's winch. The system was designed so that when the lorry's winch engaged, it would pull the recovery chain taut with approximately 10 times the force that the winch motor could generate on its own. The critical element in the entire system was timing. James had calculated that the recovery chain needed to be deployed at precisely the moment when the German tank reached the steepest part of the climb and had committed its full weight to forward momentum. If the chain was deployed too early, the tank crew would have time to react and potentially reverse course. If it was deployed too late, the tank would have passed beyond the optimal position and the mechanical advantage would be lost. James positioned himself at a concealed observation point, where he could watch the tank's approach and signal the exact moment for chain deployment. He had studied the tank's rate of climb and estimated that he would have approximately 3 seconds from the moment he gave the signal until the chain became fully taut. During those 3 seconds, the tank would travel approximately 15 meters, which meant he had to signal when the tank was exactly 15 meters short of the optimal position. If you've stayed with us this far, you're exactly the kind of viewer we make these for. Please do subscribe. As the German Panzer IV rounded the final switchback, before reaching the steepest part of the climb, Oberfeldwebel Weber was feeling confident about his unit's advance. The American position appeared to be lightly defended, and he had observed no signs of anti-tank weapons or other serious threats. His tank was performing well on the steep road, and his crew was maintaining good coordination as they approached what appeared to be their objective. Weber had no reason to suspect that the Americans had prepared any kind of trap, or that they possessed the capability to threaten his armored vehicle. Driver Klaus Hoffmann was concentrating on maintaining steady progress up the increasingly steep grade, carefully modulating the tank's throttle to avoid losing traction on the frozen surface. The Panzer IV's tracks were providing adequate grip on the hard-packed dirt road, but Hoffmann was aware that any sudden change in throttle position or steering input could cause the heavy vehicle to slide sideways on the narrow roadway. He maintained a steady pace, confident that the tank's powerful engine would carry them safely to the top of the hill. Gunner Hans Kruger was scanning the hilltop through his periscope, looking for targets and trying to assess the strength of the American position. He could see several vehicles and equipment scattered around the clearing, but no obvious defensive positions or weapons emplacements. Kruger was preparing to engage any targets that presented themselves once they reached the summit, but so far, the American position appeared to be exactly what their intelligence had indicated: a lightly defended logistics site with minimal military value. James Washington watched through his binoculars as the German tank approached the critical position on the road. The massive steel vehicle was climbing steadily, its diesel engine working hard against the steep gradient, black exhaust smoke trailing from its rear deck. James could feel his heart pounding as he prepared to give the signal that would either disable the tank or expose his small detachment to immediate retaliation. The plan he had conceived seemed logical in theory, but he was about to test principles of physics and engineering that he had learnt in Alabama timber operations against a 25-ton German tank. When the tank reached the exact position James had calculated, he gave the signal to Sergeant O'Brien, who immediately activated the wrecker lorry's winch system. The heavy recovery chain snapped taut across the road directly in front of the advancing tank, creating an obstacle that the German crew had no time to observe or react to. The Panzer IV struck the chain at full climbing speed, its forward momentum carrying it against the steel barrier with enormous force. The initial impact of the tank against the chain created a loud metallic crash that echoed across the hillside. Inside the Panzer IV, the sudden deceleration threw the crew forward against their equipments and controls, stunning them momentarily and making it impossible for driver Hoffmann to react quickly enough to prevent what happened next. The tank's forward momentum had been completely arrested by the recovery chain, but its 25-ton mass was still being pulled downward by gravity on the steep slope. For approximately 2 seconds, the tank remained motionless against the chain, its tracks spinning uselessly on the frozen ground as driver Hoffmann attempted to back down the hill. However, James's plan had anticipated this reaction the moment the chain became taut and the tank's forward progress stopped. The wrecker lorry's winch began applying massive rearward force from the pulley system, creating tension in the recovery chain that far exceeded the tank's ability to resist. The physics of the situation were working exactly as James had calculated. The tank's weight, multiplied by the steep gradient and the mechanical advantage of the pulley system, created enormous stress on the vehicle's structure. The recovery chain was applying force at the tank's center of gravity, whilst the steep slope was pulling the vehicle's mass downward and backward. These combined forces exceeded the structural limits of the tank's hull and drivetrain, creating stress concentrations that the German engineers who designed the Panzer IV had never anticipated. The catastrophic failure began at the tank's transmission, where the enormous rearward force, created by the chain system, overwhelmed the mechanical connections between the engine and drive wheels. The transmission housing, designed to handle the normal stresses of tank operation, cracked under the unprecedented load. This initial failure created a cascade effect, as other structural elements of the tank began to fail in rapid succession. Within 5 seconds of the initial impact, the recovery chain had begun cutting through the tank's hull armor near the driver's compartment. The steel chain links, under enormous tension, and applied at precisely the right angle, concentrated force on a small area of the tank's side armor. Even though the armor was 30 millimeters thick and designed to resist anti-tank projectiles, it was not engineered to withstand the sustained pressure of a steel chain under 50 tons of tension. As the chain cut deeper into the tank's hull, it began to affect critical internal systems. Electrical cables were severed, hydraulic lines were ruptured, and the tank's ammunition storage began to shift as the vehicle's internal structure was compromised. The German crew inside the tank found themselves in an increasingly desperate situation as their vehicle literally began to come apart around them. Oberfeldwebel Weber attempted to coordinate his crew's response to the crisis, but the rapid succession of mechanical failures made it impossible to regain control of the situation. The tank's radio system had been damaged by the chain cutting through the hull, preventing him from calling for support from the other vehicles in his column. The main gun's electrical firing system had also been compromised, eliminating their primary offensive capability. Most critically, the tank's engine had begun overheating as coolant lines were severed by the progressive structural failure. Driver Hoffman made a desperate attempt to reverse the tank and break free from the chain, but the transmission damage had eliminated most of his vehicle's mobility. The tank's tracks were still functional, but without a working transmission to transfer power from the engine, they could generate only minimal force. The recovery chain continued to apply enormous rearward pressure, preventing any forward movement and gradually pulling the tank further down the slope. The critical moment came approximately 15 seconds after the initial impact. The accumulated stress from the chain system, combined with the tank's weight on the steep slope, finally exceeded the structural integrity of the vehicle's hull. The Panzer IV literally split in half, with the front section containing the driver's compartment and transmission separating completely from the rear section containing the engine and fighting compartment. The massive steel recovery chain had essentially cut the 25-ton tank into two pieces through the application of pure mechanical force. The front section of the tank, no longer connected to the engine and drive system, immediately began sliding backward down the steep slope. The tracks, now free spinning without drive power, provided no resistance to the gravitational force pulling the 10-ton section towards the bottom of the hill. Driver Hoffman, trapped in the sliding hull section, could only hold on as his portion of the tank tumbled down the mountainside, bouncing off rocks and trees before finally coming to rest in the wooded valley below. The rear section of the tank, containing the engine and the other three crew members, remained on the road, but was now completely immobilized. The massive diesel engine continued running for several more minutes, but without any connection to the transmission or drive wheels, it served no purpose beyond making noise. Oberfeldwebel Weber and his remaining crew members found themselves trapped in a stationary piece of machinery that was no longer capable of movement or effective combat action. James Washington watched in amazement as his unconventional plan produced results that exceeded his most optimistic expectations. The German tank had been completely neutralized without firing a single shot, and the mechanical principles he had learnt in the Alabama timber business had proven applicable to modern armored warfare in ways that no military manual would ever describe. The recovery chain was still intact and functional, having successfully channeled enormous forces without suffering any significant damage to its own structure. However, James realized that their immediate tactical situation remained dangerous. The disabled German tank was part of a larger column, and the other vehicles in that column would undoubtedly investigate when their lead tank failed to reach its objective. Sergeant O'Brien quickly ordered his detachment to prepare defensive positions, using the disabled tank as cover, whilst also maintaining their equipment in readiness for possible evacuation if the situation deteriorated further. The second German tank in the column, another Panzer IV commanded by Unterfeldwebel Johann Richter, had been following approximately 200 meters behind Weber's vehicle when the catastrophic failure occurred. Richter and his crew heard the loud crash and saw debris flying from the lead tank's position, but the winding road and morning mist prevented them from observing exactly what had happened. Richter immediately halted his tank and attempted to establish radio contact with Weber, but received no response to his repeated calls. Major Muller, commanding the German column from his position in the third tank, was faced with a tactical puzzle. His lead tank had apparently encountered some kind of obstacle or enemy action, but the nature of the threat was unclear. Standard German doctrine called for bypassing obstacles when possible or employing overwhelming force to eliminate resistance. But the narrow mountain road offered limited maneuvering options. Muller decided to send his second tank forward to investigate whilst keeping his remaining forces in reserve until the situation could be clarified. Unterfeldwebel Richter advanced his tank cautiously up the road, maintaining constant radio contact with Major Muller and scanning carefully for signs of enemy anti-tank weapons. As he approached the location where Weber's tank had been disabled, Richter could see scattered debris and track marks, but the steep terrain and roadside vegetation obscured his view of exactly what had occurred. His gunner, Obergefreiter Ludwig Becker, was traversing the main gun back and forth, ready to engage any targets that might present themselves. James Washington observed the approach of the second German tank with growing concern. His plan had worked perfectly against the first tank, but the recovery chain was now positioned incorrectly to repeat the same tactic. The chain would need to be repositioned, which would require exposing his men to potential enemy fire whilst working on the road surface. Additionally, the German tank crews were now aware that some kind of threat existed, making them more cautious and alert than the first tank had been. Sergeant O'Brien assessed their tactical options and concluded that attempting to repeat James's chain tactic would be too risky given their current situation. Instead, he decided to implement a more conventional defensive strategy using the disabled German tank as cover and fighting positions. The split tank hull provided excellent protection against small arms fire and could potentially absorb hits from the approaching tank's main gun. O'Brien positioned his 4 soldiers around the tank wreckage, with overlapping fields of fire, hoping to create enough resistance to discourage the German advance. However, James had been studying the tactical situation and believed he could modify his original plan to work against the second tank. The key insight was that the recovery chain didn't need to be positioned across the road to be effective. It could also be used as a lateral snare if properly positioned and deployed. James proposed using the wrecker lorry to drag the chain across the road at precisely the moment when the second tank reached a vulnerable position, creating a trip mechanism rather than a direct barrier. The modified plan required perfect timing and coordination between James and the wrecker lorry operator, but it offered the possibility of disabling the second tank without exposing anyone to direct enemy fire. James positioned himself at a concealed location where he could observe the approaching tank and signal the exact moment for chain deployment. Sergeant O'Brien, despite his reservations about the unconventional tactics, authorized James to attempt his modified plan whilst maintaining the conventional defensive positions as backup. As Unterfeldwebel Richter's tank approached the debris field created by the first tank's destruction, he reduced speed and increased his scanning vigilance. The evidence of catastrophic mechanical failure was now clearly visible, with track marks, metal fragments, and fluid stains scattered across the road surface. However, Richter could not identify any obvious cause for the destruction, which made him increasingly suspicious about potential American anti-tank capabilities. James waited until the second German tank was positioned at exactly the right location before signaling for chain deployment. The wrecker lorry's winch engaged with a sharp mechanical whine, dragging the heavy recovery chain across the road surface directly beneath the tank's tracks. The chain caught the tank's left track at precisely the moment when the vehicle was negotiating a slight turn, creating enormous lateral stress on the track system and drive sprockets. The effect on the second tank was different from what had happened to the first tank, but equally devastating. The recovery chain, caught between the tank's track and the road surface, created a mechanical bind that the tank's drive system could not overcome. The left track was forced off its drive sprockets and road wheels, immediately immobilizing the tank and creating massive stress concentrations in the vehicle's transmission and hull structure. Unlike the first tank, which had been split completely in half, the second tank suffered what military engineers would classify as a mobility kill. The vehicle remained structurally intact but was no longer capable of movement. The damaged track system made it impossible for driver Otto Neumann to maneuver the tank, whilst the stress damage to the transmission eliminated most of the vehicle's mechanical power. The tank had become a stationary pillbox, capable of using its main gun but unable to advance or retreat. Unterfeldwebel Richter found himself in an extremely difficult tactical position. His tank was immobilized but still functional as a weapons platform, which meant his crew could potentially provide fire support for other German units whilst remaining vulnerable to American counterattack. However, the nature of the threat that had disabled his tank remained unclear, making it difficult to coordinate an effective response with the rest of his column. Major Muller, observing the immobilization of his second tank, realized that his unit was facing an unexpectedly capable enemy force, using tactics that German training had not prepared them to counter. The loss of 2 tanks without any visible enemy anti-tank weapons suggested that the Americans possessed some kind of unconventional capability that posed a serious threat to his entire column. Muller made the difficult decision to halt his advance and request immediate support from a higher headquarters before proceeding further. The tactical pause that followed the immobilization of the second German tank provided James Washington and his detachment with a critical opportunity to improve their defensive position and prepare for continued resistance. However, they were also acutely aware that their unconventional tactics had only temporary effectiveness. Once the German forces understood how the American traps worked, they would be able to develop countermeasures and resume their advance with overwhelming force. Sergeant O'Brien used the respite to establish better communication with American forces in the surrounding area. His radio operator, Private Rodriguez, finally succeeded in contacting elements of their 28th Infantry Division and requesting immediate support. However, the chaotic tactical situation created by the German offensive meant that no significant reinforcements would be available for several hours at minimum. O'Brien's detachment would have to continue defending their position using only the resources they had immediately available. The psychological impact of witnessing 2 tanks disabled by unknown means had a significant effect on the morale of the remaining German crews. Tank warfare doctrine emphasized the invincibility of armored vehicles against conventional infantry weapons. And the sudden destruction of 2 tanks without any visible anti-tank guns or aircraft created confusion and uncertainty amongst the German soldiers. This psychological factor would prove to be as important as the physical destruction in determining the ultimate outcome of the engagement. Major Muller's request for immediate support reached the headquarters of the 5th Panzer Army within 30 minutes of the second tank's immobilization. General von Manteuffel's staff were initially skeptical of reports describing American forces capable of destroying German tanks using unconventional methods, but the consistent reports from multiple sources forced them to take the threat seriously. The general ordered additional reconnaissance and artillery support to be directed towards Hill 212, whilst also dispatching a company of combat engineers to investigate the nature of the American defensive capabilities. The artillery support that Major Muller had requested arrived approximately 45 minutes after his initial call for assistance. A battery of 4 105mm howitzers from the German 18th Artillery Regiment began placing concentrated fire on the American position, forcing James Washington and his detachments to take cover in prepared positions amongst the rocks and trees near the summit of Hill 212. The artillery bombardment was intense but relatively brief, as German ammunition supplies were limited and needed to be conserved for the larger offensive operations. During the artillery bombardment, James had time to reflect on the extraordinary events of the past several hours. His unconventional use of logging techniques had successfully neutralized 2 German tanks, but he realized that his tactics were essentially one-time surprises that would be difficult to repeat against a prepared enemy. The recovery chain system had worked perfectly because the German tank crews had no reason to expect such an unconventional threat. But future German advances would undoubtedly include countermeasures designed to defeat similar tactics. The artillery bombardment ended as suddenly as it had begun, followed by an ominous silence that suggested the Germans were preparing for a renewed ground assault. Sergeant O'Brien gathered his 4 soldiers for a tactical briefing, outlining their limited options and the likelihood that they would soon face overwhelming enemy forces. However, before O'Brien could finalize his tactical decision, the situation changed dramatically with the arrival of American reinforcements. A platoon of Sherman tanks from the 751st Tank Battalion, along with a company of mechanized infantry, had fought their way through German positions to reach Hill 212. The arrival of these forces transformed the tactical balance and provided James Washington's detachment with the heavy weapons and manpower needed to mount an effective defense. The Sherman tank platoon was commanded by First Lieutenant Robert Taylor, a career officer from Michigan who had graduated from the Army's Armor School at Fort Knox just 18 months earlier. Lieutenant Taylor had been ordered to investigate reports of unusual German tank losses in his sector and to provide immediate support to any American forces that might be isolated by the German offensive. When he received Sergeant O'Brien's radio transmission describing the tactical situation on Hill 212, Taylor immediately recognized the strategic importance of the position and committed his entire platoon to its defense. So it says the arrival of American armor forced Major Muller to completely reassess his tactical situation. His original plan had called for a rapid advance using superior firepower to overwhelm minimal American resistance. But he now faced a reinforced position defended by tanks and infantry with strong defensive advantages. The narrow mountain road that had seemed like an ideal approach route was now clearly revealed as a tactical disadvantage, limiting his ability to deploy his forces effectively whilst exposing them to concentrated American fire from elevated positions. Lieutenant Taylor quickly established a defensive perimeter around the hilltop, positioning his Sherman tanks to provide overlapping fields of fire whilst using the terrain features to minimize their exposure to German anti-tank weapons. However, he was particularly interested in learning about the unconventional tactics that had already disabled 2 German tanks without any apparent use as a standard anti-tank weapons. Sergeant O'Brien briefed Taylor on James Washington's improvised chain tactics, providing a detailed explanation of the mechanical principles involved. Taylor's initial reaction was similar to the skepticism that O'Brien himself had felt when James first proposed his unconventional plan. However, the evidence of 2 disabled German tanks provided undeniable proof that the tactics had been effective, even if they seemed to contradict everything that conventional military doctrine taught about tank warfare. Taylor decided to incorporate James's insights into his own defensive planning, whilst also maintaining conventional anti-tank capabilities as his primary line of defense. The combination of conventional Sherman tanks with James Washington's unconventional engineering expertise created a defensive capability that the German forces were completely unprepared to counter. Major Muller's final assault on Hill 212 began at approximately 1400 hours on the 15th of December, with a coordinated attack involving his remaining 2 tanks, several self-propelled anti-tank guns, and 2 companies of mechanized infantry. The German plan called for suppressive artillery fire, followed by a rapid armored advance up the main road, with infantry forces attempting to infiltrate the American position through the wooded terrain on the flanks. Muller was confident that his superior numbers and firepower would overcome whatever resistance the Americans could offer. However, the German assault encountered James Washington's mechanical traps before it could engage the conventional American armor. James had spent the intervening hours positioning additional chain systems at multiple locations along the approach road, creating a series of obstacles that would channel the German advance into predetermined killing zones. The recovery chains were now supported by conventional anti-tank mines and obstacles, creating a layered defensive system that combined improvised engineering with standard military techniques. The 3rd German tank to attempt the ascent towards Hill 212 was commanded by Feldwebel Kurt Schroeder, an experienced non-commissioned officer who had served in North Africa before being transferred to the Western Front. Schroeder was aware that the previous 2 tanks had been disabled by unknown means, but German doctrine emphasized aggressive action over cautious advance, and Major Muller had ordered him to proceed at maximum speed to minimize exposure to whatever threat had eliminated his predecessors. Schroeder's tank struck the first of James's chain obstacles at approximately the same location where the 1st German tank had been destroyed several hours earlier. However, James had modified his tactics based on his observation of the previous encounters, positioning multiple chains in sequence to create overlapping zones of mechanical stress. The effect was even more devastating than the previous engagements, with Schroeder's tank suffering complete structural failure that left it totally destroyed and blocking the road for any vehicles that might follow. The loss of the 3rd German tank, in exactly the same manner as the previous 2, finally convinced Major Muller that his unit was facing a threat that conventional tactics could not overcome. The consistent destruction of his armor using methods that his crews could not identify or counter represented a tactical problem that was beyond his unit's capability to solve. Muller made the difficult decision to withdraw his remaining forces and report the situation to higher headquarters for evaluation and possible development of appropriate countermeasures. The German withdrawal from Hill 212 marked the end of the immediate tactical engagement, but it also represented a significant strategic victory for American forces in that sector of the front. The delay imposed on German advance elements by the unconventional defensive tactics had provided critical time for American reinforcements to arrive and establish stronger defensive positions throughout the region. James Washington's improvised engineering had contributed directly to disrupting German offensive timetables in a way that conventional weapons might not have achieved. Lieutenant Taylor's after-action report on the engagement at Hill 212 would eventually reach the attention of senior American military leadership, including elements of the Army's Engineer Command and Armor School. The report described in detail the mechanical principles that James Washington had applied and the tactical results that had been achieved, providing documentation of unconventional methods that could potentially be incorporated into standard military doctrine. However, the unique circumstances that had made James's tactics possible were unlikely to be replicated in most combat situations. The broader strategic context of the Battle of the Bulge meant that the engagement at Hill 212 was only one small part of a massive German offensive that would ultimately fail to achieve its strategic objectives. However, the tactical lessons learnt from James Washington's unconventional defensive methods would influence American thinking about anti-tank warfare and the potential applications of improvised engineering techniques in combat situations. The combination of rural mechanical knowledge with military requirements had produced results that neither traditional military training nor civilian education could have achieved independently. In the days following the engagement, James Washington found himself something of a celebrity within the 751st Tank Battalion. Word of his unconventional tactics spread rapidly through American forces in the region, with embellished versions of the story adding increasingly fantastic details to what had actually been a practical application of mechanical engineering principles. However, James himself remained focused on his assigned duties and seemed more interested in returning to routine recovery operations than in discussing his brief fame as an improvised tank destroyer. Sergeant O'Brien's official commendation of James Washington emphasized the young soldier's initiative, technical expertise, and calm performance under extreme pressure. The commendation also noted that James's actions had directly contributed to saving American lives and disrupting German offensive operations, achievements that far exceeded what might normally be expected from a 17-year-old soldier serving in a support role. The document would become part of James's military record and would eventually influence his post-war career opportunities. The German tank crews who had survived the encounters at Hill 212 were debriefed extensively by German intelligence officers seeking to understand the nature of the American defensive capabilities they had encountered. However, the survivors' descriptions of their tanks being cut in half by chains were initially dismissed as combat stress reactions or deliberate misinformation. It would be several weeks before German engineers developed a theoretical understanding of the mechanical principles involved, and several months before effective countermeasures could be incorporated into standard operating procedures. The recovery equipment that James Washington had used to create his mechanical traps remained in service with the 751st Tank Battalion throughout the remainder of the war in Europe. The heavy recovery chains, which had proven capable of destroying German tanks under the right circumstances, returned to their intended purpose of recovering disabled American vehicles from battlefield conditions. However, the chains were now viewed with a certain degree of respect by the soldiers who handled them, having demonstrated capabilities that their original designers had never envisioned. James Washington continued to serve with the 751st Tank Battalion through the remainder of the European campaign, participating in the final Allied advance into Germany and the occupation duties that followed the German surrender in May 1945. His reputation as an innovative problem solver led to assignments involving increasingly complex recovery operations, including several instances where his unconventional approaches proved to be the only viable solutions to seemingly impossible mechanical challenges. The story of how a 17-year-old farm boy from Alabama had used logging chains to destroy German tanks became part of the folklore of the 751st Tank Battalion, and eventually spread throughout American armored units serving in Europe. However, the technical details of how the tactic had actually worked were often lost in the retelling, with various versions of the story attributing the tank destructions to everything from supernatural intervention to secret American superweapons. James Washington himself rarely discussed the events at Hill 212 with his fellow soldiers, preferring to focus on his regular duties and avoiding the attention that his brief fame had generated. When directly questioned about his unconventional tactics, James would typically emphasize the mechanical principles involved rather than the dramatic circumstances of their application. His matter-of-fact attitude towards what others considered remarkable achievements reflected his rural Alabama upbringing, where improvised solutions to difficult problems were considered normal rather than exceptional. After the war, James used his veterans' benefits to attend Auburn University, where he studied mechanical engineering whilst continuing to work part-time in the timber industry. His combination of practical experience and formal education made him highly sought after by companies involved in heavy construction and industrial equipment manufacturing. He eventually established his own engineering consulting firm, specializing in heavy equipment applications and unconventional mechanical solutions. The story of the engagement at Hill 212 became part of the historical record of the Second World War, documented in unit histories, official after-action reports, and eventually in popular accounts of the Battle of the Bulge. Military historians studying unconventional tactics have consistently cited the engagement as an example of how individual initiative and technical expertise could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The case study has been used in military academies and war colleges to illustrate the importance of creative thinking and the potential applications of civilian skills in military contexts. And that concludes our story. The account of James Washington, a boy who traded cotton fields for battlefields, who brought the wisdom of Alabama timber country to the frozen hills of Belgium, who proved that sometimes the greatest weapon isn't the most powerful, but the most unexpected. His story reminds us that ingenuity and courage can turn the tide of history in the most unlikely of ways. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War. And do have a look at the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Till next time.